iron spikes thick as a man's wrist and told the town it was just bad water. But water doesn't make a town forget 14 people. Water doesn't make grown men lower their eyes. Water doesn't make a community rehearse silence for 20 years. Lean in, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story about a plantation well in Mississippi. It's about how power erases memory, how systems train entire towns to protect a lie, and how one man, bound by blood to the architect of that lie, lifted a stone that was never meant to move. In 1887, under a punishing Mississippi sun, Edmund Voss returned to Voss Hill. 5 years away had not softened the land, it had only rotted deeper. The manor sagged like a skull with its teeth knocked out. The cotton fields were no longer white with harvest, but strangled by weeds. His father, Harlan Voss, had been dead 5 years. Dead and silent. The inheritance Edmund received wasn't just debt and decaying acreage, it was atmosphere, a pressure in the air that thickened when he rode into the town of Rafford. Men who once clapped his shoulder now offered thin smiles. Women paused mid-sentence when he entered the general store. Conversations shifted like prey scenting a predator. He asked simple questions about the land, about the fields, and then about the well. That's when the temperature changed. Eyes dropped, throats cleared. Someone always found a reason to walk away. Because in the center of the abandoned slave quarters, where cabins had once stood and children had once run barefoot in the dirt, there was a well sealed beneath a massive slab of stone, spiked down, entombed, not boarded, not fenced, buried. And Edmund, surveyor, skeptic, son, felt something ancient stir in his chest. Not fear, recognition. You see, men like you understand something most never will. Silence is rarely accidental. It's engineered, maintained, protected. And when a whole town protects a hole in the ground, you don't have a well, you have a grave. And Edmund Voss was about to dig into a history that was never meant to surface. Once he broke that seal, nothing, not his name, not his bloodline, not his safety, would remain the same.
You need to understand the psychology of silence before you understand the well. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is discipline. By the time Edmund asked his third question in Rafford, he realized something critical. This wasn't ignorance, it was coordination. The blacksmith's hammer struck louder when he mentioned the well. The storekeeper suddenly needed to inventory flour. The old man on the porch, men who could recall the price of cotton in '59 down to the cent, claimed they didn't rightly remember. That kind of uniform amnesia doesn't happen by accident. It's trained, and training requires fear. The official explanation sat in a county ledger written in clean bureaucratic ink. July 14th, 1867. Water contamination due to miasmatic soil condition. Immediate sealing recommended to prevent disease. Miasm, bad air, invisible poison. Convenient, because bad air cannot testify, bad air cannot contradict, bad air cannot name names. But Edmund had spent 5 years as a land surveyor in Memphis. He mapped property lines for men who hid timber disputes and inheritance fraud behind polished smiles. He knew how institutions bury truth in language. Miasm wasn't a diagnosis, it was camouflage. And when he cross-referenced public health reports with county death records, something emerged that was far more disturbing than disease. 14 names, listed in spring of 1867 under Voss Hill Labor Registry. And then, nothing. No relocation forms, no labor transfers, no burial permits,
no recorded deaths. 14 human beings removed from the record without leaving a ripple. Men vanish in war, families scatter in famine, but 14 people tied to one property disappearing within weeks of a sealed well? That's not chaos, that's containment. And here's where it gets darker. In Reconstruction-era Mississippi, power didn't just live in plantation houses, it lived in networks, informal alliances between planters, physicians, magistrates, ministers, men who met in back rooms and called themselves protectors of order. Order. Remember that word, because order has always been the mask worn by those who fear losing control. Edmund began to see it clearly. Whatever happened in July of 1867 wasn't an accident. It wasn't disease. It was a decision protected by silence. And when silence protects a decision for 20 years, you're no longer dealing with a mistake. You're dealing with a system. And systems do not forget. They defend. The well was no longer just stone and iron. It was a vault. And Edmund was getting dangerously close to the combination.
The first crack in the wall didn't come from a ledger. It came from an old woman who had outlived fear. Her name was Ruth. She lived on the edge of Rafford in a narrow cabin beneath ancient pecan trees, the kind of place men overlook because it looks harmless. But age does something powerful to those who survive long enough. It makes them immune. When Edmund stepped onto her porch, she didn't flinch at his name. She didn't avert her eyes. She studied him. Not as Harlan Voss's son, but as a man standing at a crossroads. "You're digging," she said quietly. Not a question, a warning. Inside her cabin, the air smelled of wood smoke and memory, and for a long time she said nothing. That silence again. But this silence was different. It wasn't trained. It was heavy. Finally, she spoke the name that Rafford had swallowed for 20 years. Delia. Not the help, not one of them. Delia. A woman in her 30s in 1867, the plantation's cook, sharp-minded, controlled, the kind of presence that doesn't need to shout to command a room. She understood the law, Silas said, even if she couldn't read it herself. And that's when Edmund learned about Rosalie. Rosalie had taught herself to read in secret, using a Bible that wasn't hers to touch. Candlelight stolen, letters memorized like contraband. She became the scribe for the small freed community that remained at Wass Hill after the war. 14 souls, not wandering laborers, a community. Delia, her husband August, their children Nora, Thomas, baby Clara, August's brother Hamp, a young couple named Cornelius and Nettie, Martha, Samuel, others whose names had blurred with time, but whose lives had not. In April of 1867, under Delia's direction, Rosalie wrote a letter to the Freedmen's Bureau in Port Gibson. It was formal, measured, respectful. It requested recognition of a labor contract Harlan Voss had refused to honor. And it did something far more dangerous. It invoked federal law, the Southern Homestead Act, land ownership, not wages, land. Do you understand the threat that represented in 1867 Mississippi? A formerly enslaved community asking, not begging, for land under federal protection. That wasn't a complaint. That was a shift in power. And power, when threatened, does not negotiate. It eliminates. Ruth's voice trembled when she described what happened next. The heat changed, not the weather, the men. Harlan began riding at night, meetings in town, long talks under trees. Silas Pewitt, his overseer, never far behind. Then came the wagons, heavy, after midnight, 2 nights in July. Voices low, something dragged, then silence, deep, complete. The next morning the quarters were empty.
no cooking fires, no children, no belongings, and the well was sealed, spiked down, like something inside needed to be kept from ever rising. Ruth had kept one thing, a red-painted wooden button August had carved for Delia's Sunday dress. She found it in the dirt near the quarters the morning after. She handed it to Edmund. It was small, light, but it weighed more than the stone slab on that well, because in that moment Edmund understood something that most men never face. The truth wasn't lost, it was buried on purpose, and he was about to decide whether he had the courage to unearth it. There are men who inherit land, and there are men who inherit sin. Edmund Wass was both.
There is a moment in every man's life when he realizes the past is not behind him, it is beneath him, and if he stands still long enough, he can feel it breathing. Edmund didn't sleep the night after visiting Ruth. The red wooden button sat on the table beside his bed like an accusation. Small, hand-carved, intimate, not an artifact of business or politics, an artifact of love. And that is what made it unbearable, because systems can justify economics, they can rationalize labor disputes, they can disguise brutality as order. But love exposes the lie. 14 people had not moved on, they had not succumbed to miasma, they had asserted their rights under federal law and then vanished within weeks. And the well was sealed 2 days after the county physician wrote the words, "Conditions irregular." Irregular, a coward's phrase, a professional's escape hatch. Edmund rode back to the clearing alone the next morning. He stood over the stone slab and studied it not as a son, but as a surveyor. The iron spikes were excessive, driven deep, angled inward, not meant to secure loosely, meant to imprison. The slab itself was 5 feet across, at least a foot thick. This wasn't emergency sanitation. It was a deliberate act requiring time, labor, coordination. You don't spike down a well like that unless you are afraid of what might come up, or what someone might see if they looked down. And here's what chilled him most. The well sat at the center of the former quarters, not near the main house, not near livestock, at the heart of the freed community's living space, symbolically and physically central. Control the water, control the life, eliminate the people, eliminate the problem. He began reconstructing July of 1867 in his mind. Harlan Voss deep in debt after the war, cotton markets unstable, labor contracts contested, federal oversight present but thinning. Then a letter arrives from Delia invoking law, invoking land. Land ownership for formerly enslaved people was not merely an economic inconvenience, it was a direct assault on the racial hierarchy that defined Southern power. And men whose identity is built on hierarchy will destroy evidence before they surrender status. Edmund understood something else now, something darker. The town's silence wasn't just fear, it was complicity. Blacksmith, clerk, doctor, magistrate, even the preacher who later wrote about organized terror operating in the name of order. The Rafford Protective League, an innocuous name, protective. Of what? Not life, not justice, order. And order in post-war Mississippi meant white control at any cost. This wasn't one man losing his temper. This was a network deciding that 14 lives were an acceptable sacrifice to preserve power. The well wasn't just a burial site, it was a message. To anyone else who might dare write a letter, to anyone who believed federal law could override local dominance, to anyone who thought freedom meant autonomy. Edmund stared down at the stone and felt something shift inside him. He could sell the land, he could walk away, he could let silence continue its quiet reign, or
he could break it. But understand this: breaking silence doesn't just expose the past, it makes you an enemy of the present. And for the first time, Edmund realized that opening that well wouldn't just uncover bodies or documents, it would uncover alliances, and alliances fight back. Still, he began making arrangements, because some men inherit wealth, others inherit reckoning, and reckoning does not wait forever.
Before a man lifts a stone that heavy, he must decide who he is willing to become afterward. Because once truth surfaces, you don't get to return to ignorance, and ignorance is comfortable. Edmund understood that opening the well would not simply disturb Earth, it would disturb hierarchy. It would question the legitimacy of men still alive in Rafford, men who had built reputations on stability and order. You don't expose a buried crime in a small southern town without touching nerves. So he made a strategic decision. He would not ask anyone from Rafford to help. Silence had ruled that town for 20 years. He would not recruit from its soil. He rode miles outside county lines to a modest farm where two brothers lived, Thomas and William Hayes, strong men, no political ties, no loyalty to the Voss name. He offered them money for labor. No details, just wait. They agreed. The morning they returned to Voss Hill, the air felt charged, not storm-heavy, something older. The clearing around the well seemed almost expectant, as if the land itself remembered what it held. They began with the vines. Kudzu had woven itself through iron and stone, nature reclaiming what men had forced closed. Each cut of the blade sounded too loud in the stillness. Then the spikes. Iron thick as wrists, rusted but unyielding. It took hours to pry the first one free. When it finally released, it didn't slide out. It screamed, metal grinding against earth in a sound that made William pause mid-breath. One spike, then another, and another. Each removal felt less like dismantling a structure and more like disarming a confession. Edmund's palms blistered, sweat soaked his shirt, but beneath the physical strain was something sharper, a question. What if they find nothing? What if this is all suspicion stitched together by guilt and imagination? But that voice, the one that tempts men to retreat, was weaker now, because 14 names do not erase themselves. When the final spike came free, the stone remained, 5 feet of deliberate finality. They rigged the block and tackle, wrapped rope around the slab, anchored the tripod deep. Thomas and William leaned back, muscles straining. The stone resisted at first, as if reluctant. Then slowly it shifted. The sound that followed was not dramatic, no thunder, no cracking earth, just a low, grinding exhale, as if something had been holding its breath for 20 years. And when the seal broke, air surged upward from the well's throat, cool, damp, and carrying a scent that did not belong to simple stagnation, not just rot, not just water, something older, something metallic, something that had waited. The cicadas went quiet. Even nature seemed unwilling to intrude. The slab finally swung clear and fell to the grass with a thud that echoed across the fields. And there it was, a black mouth in the earth, open, unblinking. Edmund stepped forward and peered down. Darkness swallowed the light. 40 feet to water, by his estimate. Too deep to see, too deep to guess. He tied a rope around his waist. Thomas tightened the knot. William said nothing. No one joked, no one asked questions, because some acts don't require explanation. They require nerve. As Edmund lowered himself into that shaft, boots scraping damp stone, lantern flickering against slick walls, the temperature dropped with every foot. The air grew heavier, thicker, and somewhere between sunlight and waterline, he understood this. The descent into truth is always colder than you expect, and once you reach the bottom,
You are no longer the same man who began the climb.
Darkness has weight. Men who've never descended into it think darkness is the absence of light. It isn't. It presses. It leans against your chest. It makes your breath feel borrowed. By the time Edmund's boots touched the shallow water at the bottom of the well, the world above felt unreal, like a memory he was already leaving behind. The lantern swayed slightly from his grip, throwing fractured light across stone walls slick with decades of moisture. The water was lower than he remembered from childhood, stagnant, black, still, too still. No ripples, no insects skating across its surface, just depth. He lowered the lantern closer. That's when he saw them. Shapes, not bones, not loose debris, bundles, wrapped tight in oilcloth, bound with thick wire, heavy, intentional, resting beneath a layer of silt like preserved secrets. Not thrown, placed, organized. That detail matters. Chaos throws, control arranges. Edmund crouched in the cold water and reached down. His fingers brushed waxed canvas. The texture was firm, the weight substantial. This was no random dumping. This was storage, evidence storage. He lifted the first bundle slowly, mud releasing it with a reluctant suction. His pulse pounded in his ears, louder than the water drip echoing above. He tugged the rope, the signal. Slowly he was hoisted upward, clutching the bundle like a relic from another world. When his boots hit grass again, sunlight felt almost hostile, too bright, too normal. Thomas and William stared at the object in his hands. No one spoke. Edmund knelt, unwound rusted wire. The metal resisted, like it wanted to remain closed. Finally, it gave. The oilcloth peeled back. Inside, paper. Not skulls, not bones. Paper. Yellowed, fragile, preserved by cold and darkness. For a moment, Edmund simply stared, because what he was holding was worse than remains. Remains end stories. Documents expose systems. He unfolded the top sheet, a labor contract, signed, detailed, identical to the one Delia had referenced in her letter, proof that wages had been promised and withheld. Another sheet, affidavits, statements attesting to non-payment, names, signatures, marks beside signatures. Then the second bundle, smaller. Inside it, a tin box, sealed tight. Edmund pried it open, and there it was, a journal, leather-bound, pages filled in elegant handwriting. Rosalie's hand, Delia's voice, preserved beneath earth because someone had taken great care to protect it. And beneath the journal, a folded sheet. Edmund unfolded it carefully. 14 names, written in pencil, by Delia herself. Dia, August, Nora, Thomas, Clara, Hamp, Rosalie, Cornelius, Nettie, Martha, Samuel, and 3 more. Not a list of the dead, a list of the living. Why hide documents in a well? Because paper survives where bodies decay. Because testimony lasts longer than bone. Because someone, perhaps in their final moments, understood that truth needed burial to endure. That realization hit Edmund harder than anything else. This wasn't just evidence of crime. This was resistance. They had documented everything. They had preserved their own record. And the well was not a dumping ground. It was a vault. The town thought it buried a problem. Instead, it preserved proof. Understand this clearly. Tyranny always believes it controls the narrative. But men and women who understand power know something deeper. If you cannot win in the present, you plant truth in the future. Edmund stood there in the Mississippi heat, clutching the voices of the erased. And in that moment, he understood something that changes a man forever. The most dangerous weapon against corruption is not rage, it is record. And the record
was no longer buried. It was breathing in his hands. Most men think the moment of discovery is explosive. It isn't. It's quiet, terrifyingly quiet. The sun was still high over Voss Hill, the fields still choked with weeds. Birds still circled lazily overhead as if nothing sacred had been disturbed. But on the grass beside that open well lay something more dangerous than bones. Proof. Edmund dismissed the Hayes brothers early, paid them, thanked them, gave them no explanation. The less they knew, the safer they would be. Because by now he understood something critical. If 14 people could disappear without record, so could 3 more. He carried the tin box and documents back to the manor house, locking himself inside a study that still smelled faintly of his father's tobacco. And there, under fading afternoon light, he opened the journal. Rosalie's handwriting was steady, elegant, careful. Not hurried, not frantic, disciplined. The early entries were ordinary: weather reports, crop yields, small disputes among the community, August repairing fence lines, Martha tending herbs, children practicing letters in the dirt. But beneath those domestic rhythms ran something sharper: resolve. Delea's voice, translated through Rosalie's pen, was measured. She spoke of contracts, of wages owed, of federal law, of land petitions under the Southern Homestead Act. They weren't pleading, they were preparing. There is a difference, and power recognizes the difference instantly. As Edmund read deeper into July 1867, the tone shifted. Meetings between Harlan and men from town. Silas Pewitt watching more closely. Strangers riding near the quarters at dusk. One entry stopped him cold. Mr. Voss says we mistake our place, says paper will not protect us here, says the land remembers who it belongs to. The land remembers. That is how control speaks. It frames dominance as destiny. The final complete entry was dated July 12th. Rosalie says if anything should happen, this must be kept. Truth must wait if it cannot speak now. No entry after that. 2 days later, the official miasma report was filed. Edmund closed the journal slowly. He now knew what the well contained, but he also knew what it did not. There were no bodies in those bundles, which meant something far more disturbing. The evidence had been hidden. The people had been removed. Where and by whom? If the well preserved documentation, it suggests intention. Someone, likely Delea or Rosalie, anticipated violence, anticipated erasure, anticipated that the system would act. And here is the darker truth most men refuse to confront. When people anticipate their own disappearance, it means threats were explicit, not implied, explicit. Edmund leaned back in his father's chair and let the full architecture of power reveal itself. Harlan Voss, Silas Pewitt, Dr. Horace Gage, and the Rafford Protective League, an informal network dedicated to preserving order. Order enforced through intimidation, through example, through spectacle. 14 freed individuals invoking federal land rights represented a precedent, and precedent spreads. You don't just eliminate the people, you eliminate the idea. You make their disappearance so absolute that no one else dares follow. That's how psychological control works, not through mass slaughter, through strategic demonstration. Edmund realized the well was only half the crime. The real crime was what Rafford did afterward. They complied. They closed ranks. They practiced silence until it became instinct, until even children learned not to ask. That is institutional manipulation at its purest form. Not violence alone, memory control. And now Edmund faced a decision more dangerous than opening stone. Expose it and become an enemy of the entire county, or protect his name and become complicit. This is where men are separated, not by strength, but by allegiance, to blood or to truth. He stared at the red wooden button in his palm, and something inside him permanently shifted. The descent wasn't over. It was just beginning.
Truth does not spread quietly. It threatens quietly. Edmund understood that before he spoke a single word. By nightfall, 3 oil lamps burned low in the study. The documents lay organized across his desk: contracts, affidavits, the journal, the list of 14 names. Evidence, structured, coherent, dangerous. The first step was not accusation, it was preservation. He wrapped the originals carefully and locked them in a trunk beneath loose floorboards in his room. What he carried the next morning were copies made in his own hand through the night. If someone tried to silence him, the record would not vanish again. He rode to the county seat at Port Gibson, to the small brick office that once housed the Freedmen's Bureau and now served as a federal subagency under the district court. The clerk, a thin man with careful eyes, listened without interruption as Edmund placed the copied documents on his desk: labor contracts, affidavits, a preserved journal detailing threats prior to disappearance, and the date alignment between the final entry and the physician's miasma declaration. The clerk did not react immediately, but he did not dismiss it either. He said only this: "If what you are alleging is accurate, Mr. Voss, this is not a property matter. It is conspiracy." Conspiracy, a word that cracks foundations. By afternoon, Rafford knew Edmund had gone to Port Gibson. Small towns function like nervous systems. Every movement registers. By evening, 2 men stood on his porch. Silas Pewitt had aged, but age had not softened him, his frame still rigid, his eyes still measuring. Beside him stood Magistrate Cullen, whose father had also signed the original 1867 Health Declaration. History does not disappear, it inherits. Silas did not enter the house. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Edmund and said, "Some things are better left where they were placed." That sentence carries more menace than a shouted threat, because it implies permanence. Edmund did not answer immediately. Silence, he had learned, was the weapon Rafford understood best. But this silence was different. This silence was refusal. "I opened the well," Edmund said finally. Silas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And," the magistrate asked, "and what was buried was not disease." No denial came, no shock, just calculation. That was the confirmation Edmund needed. Innocent men demand explanation. Complicit men assess exposure. Silas stepped closer. "You're young enough to recover from mistakes," he said quietly. "Your father understood order. Don't confuse agitation with justice." There it was again. Order. The word that had justified everything. The word that erased 14 lives. Edmund felt fear then. Real fear. Because power was no longer historical. It was standing inches from him. And here is what most men misunderstand about confrontation. The danger is not physical first. It is social, economic, reputational, isolation. Silas and Cullen represented the web: bank loans, church leadership, supply chains, voting blocks. Open war would not come in gunfire. It would come in strangulation. But something had shifted inside Edmund too deeply to reverse. "You mistake me," he said evenly. "This is not agitation." He held Silas's gaze. "It's record."
That word landed harder than any accusation, because record cannot be negotiated. Record survives. The two men left without further threat, and that frightened Edmund more than anger would have, because it meant strategy. When wolves retreat silently, they are not surrendering, they are circling. Inside the house, Edmund bolted the door and leaned against it, pulse hammering. For the first time, he fully understood the cost. Breaking silence doesn't end the system, it provokes it. The well had been a vault. Now the town itself would become a battlefield of narrative, and narrative, unlike stone, fights back. The question was no longer whether truth existed. The question was whether it would be allowed to stand. And Rafford had protected its version of events for 20 years. It would not relinquish control easily. But Edmund had something they did not expect: documentation, duplicated, placed in federal hands. Once paper moves beyond local reach, the game changes. The silence had been cracked. Now it would either shatter or close violently. And morning was coming.
Retaliation rarely announces itself. It accumulates. 3 days after Edmund's visit to Port Gibson, the first response arrived, not in violence, but in absence. The bank declined renewal of his operating credit. No explanation, just restructuring considerations. The supply merchant who had delivered seed for years suddenly required advance payment in full. Church elders postponed his invitation to speak at Sunday gathering. Polite, measured, coordinated. Silas had not been idle. This is how entrenched power disciplines dissent, not with spectacle, with isolation. Edmund expected it. What he had not expected was the letter. It arrived with a federal seal, a formal notice that a preliminary inquiry would be opened into the 1867 disappearance of 14 freed individuals formerly residing on Voss Hill. The language was restrained, but its implications were not. Witnesses would be requested, county records reviewed, medical certifications examined, signatories identified, and for the first time in 2 decades, Rafford's silence would be tested under oath. That is when fear shifted directions, because systems built on secrecy can withstand rumor. They cannot withstand documentation plus jurisdiction. Silas returned that evening alone. No magistrate this time, no measured civility. "You've made a mistake," he said flatly. Edmund did not offer him a seat. "What I've made," Edmund replied, "is a record beyond your reach." The old overseer's eyes hardened. "You think Washington cares about 14 colored laborers from 20 years ago?" There it was, reduction, minimization, the oldest tactic in power preservation. Edmund held steady. It isn't about caring, it's about precedent. That word again, precedent, spreads. If Rafford's actions were proven, if contracts were documented, threats recorded, coordinated disappearance established, then the Protective League would not be remembered as guardians of order. They would be remembered as conspirators. And legacy matters deeply to men who claim moral authority. Silas leaned closer. "You're burning your father's name." Edmund felt the weight of that, because it was true. Whatever emerged from the inquiry would not isolate guilt cleanly. Harlan Voss's signature appeared on contracts. His meetings were documented in Rosalie's journal. His silence after July 1867 was no longer neutral. Exposing the system meant exposing blood. This is the crucible, when truth requires self-indictment. Edmund's voice lowered. "My father burned it himself." The words hung between them like a severed rope. For the first time, something flickered in Silas's expression. Not anger, not arrogance, recognition. because deep down, even loyal enforcers know the line they crossed, and they know history eventually circles back. "You don't understand what you're inviting," Silas said quietly. "Oh, I do," Edmund replied. And he did. He understood that testimony could unravel marriages, careers, reputations, that old men might face public shame, that children would learn what their fathers had done. He understood the economic consequences, the social exile, perhaps even violence. But he also understood something stronger. Silence had already cost 14 lives. Continuing it would cost more. Silas left without another word. 2 weeks later, federal investigators arrived in Rafford. 3 men, methodical, unimpressed by local stature. They began with the well, measured depth, examined stone slab markings, collected the remaining bundles, interviewed Thomas and William Hayes, reviewed bank records from 1867, compared physician reports with journal timelines, and slowly, carefully, the story that had been buried began assembling itself in official ink. Witnesses who had practiced silence for 20 years found their voices faltering under oath. The blacksmith remembered late-night wagon repairs. A former stable hand recalled horses ridden hard toward the river. A retired farmhand spoke of a clearing miles south where ground had once been disturbed. The pattern sharpened. Not spontaneous violence, organized removal. Bodies never placed in the well, transported, disposed of elsewhere. The well had not been a grave. It had been a decoy, a vault for the record. The real burial ground remained to be found, and when that possibility surfaced publicly, Rafford's composure cracked. Because secrets hidden in paper can be debated, secrets hidden in earth cannot.
They found the graves in late autumn, not because someone confessed, because erosion did. 2 miles south of Rafford, near a bend in the river where cotton once grew thick, heavy rains carved through a low embankment and exposed something pale beneath the soil. Bone does not argue. It does not spin narrative. It does not fear reputation. It simply remains. The investigators were methodical, careful, silent in a way that was no longer protective, but reverent. 14 sets, buried close, not scattered, no coffins, no markers, but not chaotic either. Arranged. Even in murder there had been order. That detail would haunt Rafford more than anything else, because it proved planning, coordination, intent. The trial that followed did not resemble dramatic spectacle. It was slower than outrage, colder than anger. Contracts were presented. The journal was entered into evidence. Threats documented in ink decades old were read aloud in a courtroom where grandchildren of the accused now sat. The physician's miasma declaration collapsed under cross-examination. No epidemic records, no corroboration, just a signature, and signatures matter. Silas Pewitt did not confess, but under oath his contradiction stacked high enough to bury him in his own testimony. The magistrate's father was long dead, but official misconduct attached to his name in public record, and Harlan Voss, already in the grave, could not defend himself. History rendered its judgment without his participation. Here is the part most stories dramatize incorrectly. Justice did not feel triumphant. There were no cheers, no public celebrations, only a quiet, sobering recognition that the town had carried rot beneath its surface for 20 years, and that rot had been fed by silence. Edmund testified, not as an avenger, not as a hero, but as a witness. He spoke of the well, of the bundles, of the journal, of the red wooden button carved by August for Delia's Sunday dress. He did not raise his voice. He did not embellish.
He simply placed record beside record and let truth do what truth does when it is finally given air. The verdicts came in measured language: conspiracy, obstruction, fraudulent documentation, accessory to unlawful killing. Some of the older men would spend their final years in prison. Others, implicated but less central, were publicly disgraced and stripped of office. No punishment equaled 14 lives. Nothing ever could. But something vital shifted in Rafford. The narrative changed. School children would no longer learn about a mysterious summer illness. They would learn names: Dia, August, Nora, Thomas, Clara, Hamp, Rosalie, Cornelius, Nettie, Martha, Samuel, and 3 others once blurred by time, now restored in county record. A memorial was erected near the river, not grand, not ornamental, stone, simple. 14 names carved clean and deep, and beside them one sentence: truth waited. We will not make it wait again. As for Edmund, he did not become universally admired. Some never forgave him. Some never spoke to him again. Economic losses came. Partnerships dissolved. But something else grew in their place: respect from unexpected corners, letters from distant towns where similar silences had lingered, requests for copies of the trial transcripts, because precedent spreads. Remember that. The well remained open, not as spectacle, but as reminder. Covered now with iron grating, transparent, you could look down and see darkness and know it no longer owned the story. There is a difference between inheriting land and inheriting legacy. Land can be sold. Legacy must be confronted. Edmund Voss inherited both, and in choosing truth over comfort, he did something rare. He ended a silence that had mistaken itself for permanence. Because silence feels eternal until someone decides it isn't. And once broken, it never seals the same way again.
But the well was only the beginning. Its stones had held more than documents. They had held the weight of a system, a carefully constructed, decades-long lattice of fear, obedience, and erased lives. And once the first layer of secrecy was pierced, the deeper rot revealed itself. Edmund had glimpsed the surface, but the town's real darkness lived in habits, in agreements forged in shadows, in the unspoken pacts that had guided every handshake, every ledger entry, every glance exchanged across store counters and porches. He began to notice patterns he had overlooked before. Men who seemed harmless were not. Families that kept to themselves were silent not out of shyness, but because survival required complicity. Every corner of Rafford whispered with the memory of Voss Hill, but nobody dared to name it. And the more Edmund walked the streets, spoke to surviving witnesses, and reviewed old records, the more he realized that the truth was bigger than his family, bigger than the 14 lives buried near the river. It was structural, systemic, embedded in the culture of power itself. Some of the wealthiest citizens of Claiborne County had profited from similar acts. Small towns across the South carried their own wells, their own secrets. And those who questioned them, who attempted to record them, had disappeared without a trace. Silence had been enforced as rigorously as law. And here, in the shadows of Voss Hill, Edmund understood the mechanism. Fear was cultivated, maintained, and transmitted. Every generation learned it. Every child understood it. The invisible chains were real, and for years nobody had dared to cut them. He saw it most clearly in the men who had once been overseers. Silas Pewitt had been one, and while he'd vanished, others still lingered. Quiet, respectable, almost invisible. Their hands carried old debts, their eyes carried old threats, and their influence had not ended with the 1860s.
The town had been remade in the image of that violence, and even 20 years later, those habits persisted, hidden behind polite smiles and polite commerce. Edmund felt the same cold dread he had felt standing over the open well, but now it was larger. This was not just a plantation secret, it was a blueprint of control. And control, he realized, was a living thing. It didn't die. It mutates, disguises itself, and waits for the next generation to enforce it. And here is the critical moment. Some of you watching this are carrying your own wells, inherited from families, systems, schools, or unseen hierarchies. The silence isn't just in Rafford, it is everywhere. And knowing about it is the first dangerous, powerful step toward breaking it. If you understand that, if you feel that prickling awareness in your chest, type, "I see the shadows" in the comments. Then type it again. Do not skip this. Say it. Embrace it. Let it mark the moment you acknowledge the system's grip and the possibility of cutting it. Because once you do, nothing remains the same. Not your perception, not your choices, not the quiet corners of your world that have felt untouchable until now. Edmund's descent had become more than investigation. It was initiation. And you, like him, are standing at the edge of that knowledge. Would you step forward or turn back into the darkness that has always felt safer?
Edmund descended further into the archives of Rafford, into corners even the county clerk hesitated to open. The air there was thick with dust and unspoken truths, a tangible weight pressing on his chest. Each ledger, each brittle sheet seemed to pulse with hidden life, names erased, amounts falsified, transactions recorded only in whispers. The deeper he dug, the more the threads of Voss Hill's horror wove themselves into the fabric of the entire town. This was not a single crime. This was a methodical architecture of suppression, a design that had survived wars, reconstruction, and generations of silence. He uncovered letters written in the dead of night, addressed to officials far beyond Claiborne County, pleading for intervention, for justice, for acknowledgement. And yet, every plea had been met with bureaucratic indifference or calculated evasion. Some letters had been returned unopened, others had been lost. Edmund realized with a sinking feeling that what he was holding in his hands was only the surface of a deliberate erasure, the tip of an iceberg whose depth stretched further than any town map could reveal. The more he studied, the clearer the pattern became. Every act of freedom claimed by the 14 souls at Voss Hill had been quietly, cruelly nullified. Contracts, wages, letters, even the very recognition of their existence had been buried, not just in the well, but in every ledger, every handshake, every law conveniently ignored. The system didn't merely punish those who defied it, it obliterated them from history, leaving behind only silence as testimony. And silence, Edmund understood now, was a weapon. It was not passive. It shaped perception, trained obedience, instilled fear, and controlled thought. The townspeople had been molded by it, generation after generation. Children grew up absorbing the unspoken rules, the unchallenged hierarchies. They learned which questions were dangerous, which truths would cost more than they could afford. Rafford was not an anomaly. It was a microcosm of how control perpetuates itself, quietly, invisibly, across societies. Yet even in this suffocating darkness, Edmund felt the faint pulse of resistance. The act of unsealing the well, the simple courage to read the names, to acknowledge the crime, had ignited something. One man's refusal to accept erasure, one man's insistence on witnessing truth had begun to fracture the spell. And that fracture, however small, radiated outward, threatening the fragile edifice of silence. He turned over another ledger, and a folded note slipped from between the pages. Its edges were blackened with age, its ink faded but legible. It read, "We see everything. We know what must remain buried. Speak, and you will join them." A shiver ran down his spine. Threats from the past, preserved on paper, yet alive in intent. This was no longer just history. It was a living warning, a reminder that truth carries a price. And Edmund, holding the note, knew the descent was only just beginning. The town had trained itself to survive on fear, but he was learning to survive on knowledge. And knowledge, unlike fear, cannot be contained. This was no longer just an investigation, it was awakening.
Edmund returned to Voss Hill under a sky swollen with the promise of storm. The plantation, once a kingdom of discipline and quiet terror, now seemed to leer at him with its hollowed windows, its broken shutters, and the wild tangles of kudzu strangling every fence post. Each step across the cracked clay paths reminded him that this ground had been a stage for human cruelty, orchestrated with the precision of a dark mind at work. The well, still sealed by decades of neglect and fear, pulsed in his thoughts, a heartbeat in the center of a silent tomb. He remembered Silas Pute's words, the old overseer who had warned him long ago. Some corners of this place are better left alone. But Edmund had learned that the corners were not dangerous because of what lay hidden. They were dangerous because of what they revealed. The truth had a weight far heavier than iron or stone. It crushed complacency, exposed complicity, and shattered illusions of innocence. Every tree, every ruined cabin seemed to whisper names long erased, accusing him with their absence. He could feel the presence of the 14 souls, as if they were watching, waiting for someone brave enough to acknowledge them. The pattern of violence became undeniable as he traced the steps of those who had vanished. Harlan Voss, a man whose outward calm masked a predator's cunning, had orchestrated more than just the silencing of a labor dispute. He had enlisted allies, neighbors, men bound by a code of fear and power to ensure that no voice rose to challenge his authority. The Rafford Protective League had been the instrument of this silence, a network of intimidation disguised as loyalty and propriety. They acted like shadows in the night, leaving no trace but the absence of life and testimony. Edmund's own pulse quickened as he realized the depth of the conspiracy. This was not merely a local matter, it was a lesson in the mechanics of control, a blueprint for how societies erase inconvenient truths. And now, decades later, the same mechanisms of fear and obedience still lingered, dormant but watchful, ready to reactivate should anyone step too close to their carefully maintained equilibrium. Every glance of the townspeople, every murmured excuse was a reminder of how power can endure in silence, shaping generations without ever being seen. He knelt by the edge of the well, letting his fingers brush against the cold stone, feeling the subtle tremor of age and neglect. The iron spikes, rusted but unyielding, seemed to mock him with their permanence. He knew that opening it would not only unearth physical objects, but memories, accusations, and a history carefully scrubbed from the annals of law and conscience. Every movement toward that stone was a movement into danger, into a moral and psychological labyrinth designed to unseat the unprepared. Edmund took a deep breath, sensing the weight of centuries pressing down. This was the point of no return. The act of uncovering the well was not just excavation, it was defiance. It was a refusal to let the past remain buried, to let the dead be forgotten. And in that refusal, he felt the first stirrings of power, the kind that comes not from dominion over others, but mastery over fear itself. He placed his hand firmly on the stone. The first strike of the crowbar would echo far beyond this clearing, and when it did, nothing and no one would ever be the same again. The first strike of the crowbar rang out like a gunshot in the stillness, reverberating across the overgrown fields. Birds took flight, their wings slicing through the hot Mississippi air, as if fleeing from a truth too terrible to witness. Edmund's hands shook, not from the effort, but from the anticipation of what lay beneath, a fear older than memory itself, a darkness deliberately placed to test the courage of any who dared confront it. Every fiber of his being screamed to pause, to step back and pretend ignorance, but he had passed that point. Curiosity had become obligation. Obligation had become inevitability. As the stone shifted, groaning and grinding against iron spikes embedded decades ago, a pungent breath of air rose from the well, cold, damp, and heavy with the scent of history. It was the smell of abandonment, of secrets left to fester in silence, but it carried something else, a metallic tang, almost like blood long dissolved into water. Edmund felt it claw at the back of his throat, a chemical warning, or perhaps a spiritual one. The men beside him, Thomas and William Hayes, tightened their grips on the ropes, muscles taut, faces unreadable, yet even their silence seemed to acknowledge the danger in what they were about to witness. As the slab finally tipped, crashing to the ground with a thud that seemed to shake the earth itself, a rush of stale, unmoving air poured from the well. It was as if a coffin had exhaled after decades of suffocation. Edmund peered over the edge, lantern trembling in his hand, and saw them. Shapes obscured beneath silt and darkness, their outlines vague but unmistakably deliberate. Bundles, objects wrapped tightly, meant to endure the passage of time untouched, unseen, unspoken about. Edmund's stomach turned as he realized the truth he had been chasing. These were not merely artifacts of labor or records of forgotten work. They were witnesses, silent yet screaming, to a crime meticulously buried. Every instinct in him, every lesson in caution passed down through years of surveying, shouted that what he was about to do was dangerous yet necessary. With careful hands he reached for the first bundle, oilcloth damp from decades of submerged silence. The weight was real, tangible, and terrifying. As he lifted it toward the surface, the earth seemed to hold its breath with him. Every movement carried the gravity of a world that had insisted on forgetting. Here, in this moment, Edmund was no longer just a man seeking answers. He was a keeper of a truth so dangerous it had taken 20 years to be concealed, and whose revelation would ripple far beyond the confines of Voss Hill.
The bundle emerged from the depths like a coffin surfacing from a watery grave. Edmund's fingers, slick and trembling, traced the outlines of the oilcloth, the thick wire bindings cold and unyielding against his skin. Every tug felt like pulling on history itself, forcing decades of silence into the light. When the last coil of rusted wire gave way, a faint metallic echo rang out, mingling with the sudden chorus of cicadas, birds, and the far-off whisper of wind through cypress trees. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The world of Rafford, the conspiracies, the hidden alliances, the suppressed truths, waited with bated breath. Edmund peeled back the layers. The first reveal was a collection of brittle yellow documents, their edges frayed, water-stained, but remarkably preserved. He spread them carefully on the grass, the oilcloth exhaling a faint, musty breath, as if relieved to finally relinquish its charge. There were contracts, affidavits, labor agreements, paperwork that spoke of lives systematically erased. Names, signatures, marks, all painstakingly recorded by hands that dared hope for justice. The paper itself seemed alive, vibrating with the weight of what had been stolen. Wages, dignity, existence. Each line, each loop of ink was a tether to humanity, snapped cruelly 20 years ago, and now reclaimed. The second bundle was smaller, yet heavier in significance. Edmund pried open the tin box inside, its metal tarnished, lid groaning like the hinges of a long-closed crypt. Within lay another trove of documents, and most disturbingly, a leather-bound journal. The pages, filled with delicate flowing script, were Rosalie's handwriting, the painstaking transcription of Delea's voice, the matriarch of the lost community. This journal was more than paper. It was memory rendered tangible, the voice of the silenced preserved against time, neglect, and deliberate erasure. Edmund's breath hitched as he opened to a random page, reading the past as though it were a whisper in his ear, a forbidden message meant only for him. And then, beneath the journal, he found it. A single folded sheet, edges softened by decades underwater. 14 names were written in pencil, fragile yet indelible, each a life, a story, a soul deliberately targeted for disappearance. Delea, August, Nora, Thomas, Clara, Hamp, Rosalie, Cornelius, Nettie, Martha, Samuel, and 3 others now blurred by time. Edmund spoke them aloud, his voice cracking, each syllable a hammer striking the armor of denial, breaking the town's decades-long pact of silence. The weight of their absence, of the unrecorded crime, pressed down like the very stones that had sealed the well. It all clicked. The miasmatic report, the irregular conditions, the missing names, Ruth's whispered memories. The well had not been sealed for disease. It had been sealed for truth, for accountability, for evidence that could have undone the carefully constructed illusion of order maintained by Harlan Voss and the silent complicity of Rafford itself. Edmund's hands shook, the tin box and bundles a tangible link to horrors long denied. This was the moment history demanded to be acknowledged, the point where curiosity became responsibility. Edmund realized the danger he now carried, not just in physical risk, but in awakening forces still dormant in the town's memory. Every document, every name was a detonator in a landscape built on fear and suppression. To expose this was to invite confrontation with the unspoken power structures that had orchestrated disappearance, enforced silence, and cultivated terror. And Edmund understood, with a deep, bone-deep certainty, that once this knowledge existed outside the well, nothing, not the past, not Rafford, not even he, would ever be the same. The air seemed to thicken around him, heavy with unspoken judgment, anticipation, and inevitability. He was holding the key to a past designed to remain hidden, and the moment of reckoning had begun. Do you want me to continue with section 16, where the first major revelation of the journal is fully unveiled?
The bundle emerged from the depths like a coffin surfacing from a watery grave. Edmund's fingers, slick and trembling, traced the outlines of the oilcloth, the thick wire bindings cold and unyielding against his skin. Every tug felt like pulling on history itself, forcing decades of silence into the light. When the last coil of rusted wire gave way, a faint metallic echo rang out, mingling with the sudden chorus of cicadas, birds, and the far-off whisper of wind through cypress trees. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The world of Rafford, the conspiracies, the hidden alliances, the suppressed truths, waited with bated breath. Edmund peeled back the layers. The first reveal was a collection of brittle yellow documents, their edges frayed, water-stained, but remarkably preserved. He spread them carefully on the grass, the oilcloth exhaling a faint, musty breath, as if relieved to finally relinquish its charge. There were contracts, affidavits, labor agreements, paperwork that spoke of lives systematically erased.
Names, signatures, marks, all painstakingly recorded by hands that dared hope for justice. The paper itself seemed alive, vibrating with the weight of what had been stolen: wages, dignity, existence. Each line, each loop of ink was a tether to humanity, snapped cruelly 20 years ago, and now reclaimed. The second bundle was smaller, yet heavier in significance. Edmund pried open the tin box inside, its metal tarnished, lid groaning like the hinges of a long-closed crypt. Within lay another trove of documents, and most disturbingly, a leather-bound journal. The pages, filled with delicate flowing script, were Rosali's handwriting, the painstaking transcription of Delea's voice, the matriarch of the lost community. This journal was more than paper. It was memory rendered tangible, the voice of the silenced preserved against time, neglect, and deliberate erasure. Edmund's breath hitched as he opened to a random page, reading the past as though it were a whisper in his ear, a forbidden message meant only for him. And then, beneath the journal, he found it. A single folded sheet, edges softened by decades underwater. 14 names were written in pencil, fragile yet indelible, each a life, a story, a soul deliberately targeted for disappearance. Delea, August, Nora, Thomas, Clara, Hamp, Rosalie, Cornelius, Nettie, Martha, Samuel, and 3 others now blurred by time. Edmund spoke them aloud, his voice cracking, each syllable a hammer striking the armor of denial, breaking the town's decades-long pact of silence. The weight of their absence, of the unrecorded crime, pressed down like the very stones that had sealed the well. It all clicked. The miasmatic report, the irregular conditions, the missing names, Ruth's whispered memories. The well had not been sealed for disease. It had been sealed for truth, for accountability, for evidence that could have undone the carefully constructed illusion of order maintained by Harlan Voss and the silent complicity of Rafford itself. Edmund's hands shook, the tin box and bundles a tangible link to horrors long denied. This was the moment history demanded to be acknowledged, the point where curiosity became responsibility. Edmund realized the danger he now carried, not just in physical risk, but in awakening forces still dormant in the town's memory. Every document, every name was a detonator in a landscape built on fear and suppression. To expose this was to invite confrontation with the unspoken power structures that had orchestrated disappearance, enforced silence, and cultivated terror. And Edmund understood, with a deep, bone-deep certainty, that once this knowledge existed outside the well, nothing, not the past, not Rafford, not even he, would ever be the same. The air seemed to thicken around him, heavy with unspoken judgment, anticipation, and inevitability. He was holding the key to a past designed to remain hidden, and the moment of reckoning had begun. Do you want me to continue with section 16, where the first major revelation of the journal is fully unveiled?
The late afternoon sun slanted through the thick cypress, casting jagged shadows across the overgrown clearing. Edmund felt it before he saw it, a movement too deliberate, too measured to be a stray animal. The hairs along the back of his neck prickled as he sensed a presence, cold and patient, observing him from the edge of the woods. The journal felt heavier now, a burden of truth he could not discard, a talisman that made him a target. He stood slowly, scanning the tree line. Something shifted, a faint rustle of leaves, the crunch of dead branches under careful feet. Not wind, not wildlife. Someone was out there. The decades-old conspiracy, long buried, was not dead. It had merely waited.
He thought of the Rafford Protective League, the whispered name that had haunted county records, a network that operated like a ghost army, loyal to secrecy and fear. They were silent, unseen, yet capable of brutal efficiency. Edmund realized that holding Rosali's journal painted a target squarely on his back. His pulse quickened. Every instinct told him to run, to disappear into the tangled underbrush, but the journal was a beacon of accountability. He could not flee. To do so would allow history to remain buried, the 14 names erased once more. The man in him, the one trained to survey, to see patterns, to understand boundaries, forced him to observe the movement instead of reacting blindly. A figure emerged, a tall man, face obscured by shadow, hands tucked into the pockets of a dark coat that blended perfectly with the tree line. Silence stretched, oppressive and thick. Then the voice, low and deliberate, broke through. Edmund Voss. It was not a greeting, it was an announcement, a declaration that the past, long suppressed, had arrived to confront him. The figure stepped closer, revealing a face partially hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat, eyes sharp and calculating. Every line of his stance spoke of discipline, of someone trained to move without leaving a trace, someone who understood the weight of fear. Edmund's hand instinctively clutched the journal, pressing it against his chest. This was no ordinary threat. This was the manifestation of decades of protected silence, a living sentinel of the town's darkest deeds. "Step away from the papers," the man continued, voice smooth but edged with steel. "You have no idea what you're holding. The truth, it is dangerous. For you, for them, for everyone who knows." Edmund's mind raced. He had anticipated resistance, but not confrontation this immediate, this personal. The journal was not just evidence, it was a spark that could ignite long-buried vengeance. Every story, every name, every signature threatened the foundations of Rafford's carefully constructed silence. The man before him was its enforcer. Edmund met his gaze steadily. "I am not afraid," he said, though his throat burned with tension, "and I will not let 14 lives be erased again. Whoever you are, whatever you represent, know this, their story will be told." A slow, deliberate laugh emerged from beneath the hat, dry and unsettling, like wind through a crypt. "So much fire in one man," the figure murmured. "Do you really believe words can undo what was done?" Edmund clenched the journal tighter. Words could not undo the past, but they could awaken the present. And he knew, in that charged, tense moment, that the first move in this dangerous game would be his. He took a deliberate step forward.